The dust had settled hours ago, but Caleb Thorne could still taste it on his tongue. He stood at the edge of his porch, one hand resting on the weathered post, the other holding a tin cup of coffee gone cold. The sun was lowering itself behind the ridge, painting the valley in shades of copper and ash. His ranch stretched quiet before him, 20 acres of hard earth, a barn that leaned slightly west, and a corral holding 3 horses that weren't worth what he'd paid for them. It wasn't much, but it was his. He raised the cup to his lips, then paused. 3 small shapes sat at the edge of his property, just beyond the fence line. Not moving, not speaking, just sitting in the dirt like stones someone had set there and forgotten. Caleb squinted against the dying light. Children. 2 boys and a girl by the look of them. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10. They wore clothes too thin for the evening chill, and their faces were smudged with road dust. The girl clutched something in her lap, a bundle of cloth, maybe. The boys sat on either side of her, shoulders pressed together like they were holding each other upright. Caleb didn't move. He'd learned long ago that strangers were rarely a gift. Out here, people brought trouble or tragedy, and sometimes both wrapped in the same coat. He'd built this place to be alone, to leave behind the noise and blood of the life he'd walked away from. He didn't need complications, but the children didn't leave. Minutes passed. The sky deepened to violet. The girl shifted slightly, adjusting whatever she held, but none of them stood. None of them called out. Caleb set the cup down on the porch rail and stepped into the yard. His boots crunched over the dry earth as he crossed toward them. The boys watched him approach with wide, unblinking eyes. The girl kept her gaze down, her hands tightening on the bundle. He stopped a few feet away, thumbs hooked into his belt. "You lost?" The oldest boy, dark-haired, sharp-featured, shook his head slowly. "Then what are you doing sitting outside my fence?" The boy glanced at the girl. She didn't look up. After a moment, the boy reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He held it out toward Caleb, arm extended but trembling slightly. Caleb stared at the paper, then at the boy's face, then at the girl who still hadn't raised her eyes. He took the note. The paper was worn soft at the creases, like it had been folded and unfolded many times. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Someone had taken their time with this. Caleb Thorne, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. I don't have long now, and there's no one else I can ask. These are my sister's children. Their mother died 2 winters past, and I've done what I could. But the sickness has me now, too. I'm leaving them with you because you're the only man I ever knew who kept his word, even when it cost him everything. I know you won't want this. I know you left that life behind. But I'm asking anyway, because I have no choice, and because I believe, even now, that you're still the man who carried me out of that canyon when no one else would come back. Their names are Samuel, Lucas, and Ivy. They're good children. They deserve better than what I can give them now. Do what you think is right. You always did. Thomas Kern. Caleb read it twice, then a third time slower, as if the words might change. Thomas Kern. He hadn't heard that name in 7 years, hadn't thought about him in longer. They'd ridden together once, back when Caleb still wore a badge and believed in things like law and order. Thomas had been a scout, quick-eyed, steady-handed, and loyal in a way that felt rare even then. Caleb remembered the canyon, remembered the ambush, the blood, the way Thomas had taken a bullet through the shoulder and kept firing anyway. Remembered dragging him 3 miles through the desert while the sun tried to kill them both. But that was another life, another version of himself. He folded the note and looked at the children again. Samuel met his gaze with something that wasn't quite defiance, more like a challenge, as if daring Caleb to turn them away. Lucas looked younger, softer, his face pale beneath the dust. Ivy still hadn't lifted her head. "Where's your uncle now?" Caleb asked quietly. "Dead," Samuel said. His voice was flat, but there was a tremor beneath it. 2 days ago. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. He pushed it down. "You got family elsewhere? Anyone who could take you in?" Samuel shook his head. "Uncle Thomas said you were it." He was wrong. The words came out harder than he'd intended. Samuel flinched, and Lucas's eyes went glassy. Ivy's hands tightened on the bundle until her knuckles went white. Caleb looked away toward the horizon where the last light was bleeding out of the sky. He thought about Thomas, about the promise he'd never asked for and the debt he'd never agreed to pay. He thought about the quiet he'd built here, the distance he'd carved between himself and everything that had come before. He thought about turning around and walking back into his house, leaving them sitting there until they gave up and moved on. But he didn't. Instead, he crouched down until he was at eye level with Ivy. She finally looked up. Her eyes were green and red-rimmed, and she was holding the bundle so tightly it shook. "What have you got there?" he asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated, then slowly peeled back a corner of the cloth. A baby, no older than a few months, swaddled tight and fast asleep. Its tiny face was flush pink, oblivious to the world collapsing around it. Caleb's breath caught. "That's our sister," Samuel said quietly. "Rose." Caleb stared at the child, at the four of them sitting in the dirt like refugees from a war he'd thought was over. He stood slowly, the note still clutched in his hand. "Come inside," he said finally. "We'll figure this out in the morning." Samuel stood first, pulling Lucas up with him. Ivy rose carefully, cradling the baby against her chest. They followed Caleb through the gate, past the corral, up onto the porch. He didn't look back at the empty road behind them, but as he opened the door and let them into the warmth of his small house, he felt the weight of Thomas's words pressing down on him like a hand on his shoulder. "Do what you think is right. You always did." Caleb wasn't sure he knew what that was anymore. But the children were inside now, and the door was closed, and the choice, whether he wanted it or not, had already been made. The children ate in silence. Caleb set out what he had: hardtack, beans warmed over the stove, a heel of bread he'd been saving. It wasn't much, but they didn't complain. Samuel ate slowly, methodically, his eyes darting around the room as if cataloging every exit. Lucas barely touched his food, just pushed it around the plate with a spoon. Ivy held the baby in one arm and ate with the other, her movements careful and practiced. Caleb sat across from them, arms folded, watching. He hadn't spoken since they'd come inside. He didn't know what to say. The house felt smaller now, crowded in a way it hadn't been an hour ago. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the walls, and the only other sound was the soft clink of spoons against tin. Finally, Samuel set his spoon down. "We can work," he said. His voice was quiet but firm. "We're not asking for charity. We can earn our keep." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You're 10 years old." "I'm 12, Samuel corrected. "And I've worked before. I can chop wood, mend fences, feed animals. Lucas can help too. Ivy looks after Rose, but she can cook and clean. I'm not looking for hired hands." "Then what are you looking for?" The question hung in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. Caleb met Samuel's gaze and saw something too old for a 12-year-old boy. Grief, maybe, or exhaustion, or both. "I'm looking," Caleb said slowly, "to live my life without complications." "We're not complications," Samuel said. "We're just here. That's the complication." Lucas's head snapped up, and his eyes filled with tears. Ivy pulled the baby closer, her jaw tightening. Samuel didn't move, but his hands curled into fists on the table. Caleb felt the words land like stones. He looked away toward the fire. "I didn't ask for this," he said, quieter now. "Your uncle, he had no right to send you here." "He didn't have a choice," Samuel said. "Neither do we." Caleb stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He crossed to the window and stared out into the darkness. The valley was invisible now, swallowed by night. He could see his own reflection in the glass. Older, harder, alone. "There's an orphanage in Ridgefield," he said without turning around. 2 days' ride east. I'll take you there in the morning. They'll find you a home." "No!" Samuel's voice was louder now, edged with something close to panic. Caleb turned. "No," Samuel repeated. "We're not going to an orphanage. Uncle Thomas sent us to you. He trusted you. He shouldn't have. But he did." Caleb crossed his arms. "You don't know me, boy. You don't know what I've done or who I am." "I know you saved his life once," Samuel shot back. "I know he said you were a good man. That's more than we've got anywhere else." Being good doesn't make me responsible for you. Then what does? The question cut through the room like a blade. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't have an answer. Ivy stood slowly, the baby still cradled against her chest. She looked at Caleb with those red-rimmed green eyes, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Please. That single word carried more weight than all of Samuel's arguments combined. It wasn't defiant or desperate, just quiet, honest, and impossible to ignore. Caleb looked at her, at the baby sleeping in her arms, at Lucas, who was staring down at his plate like he wanted to disappear, at Samuel, who was trying so hard to hold everything together that he was shaking. He thought about Thomas again, about the canyon, the blood, the weight of a body slung over his shoulders, about the promise he'd never made but somehow owed anyway. 1 week, Caleb said finally. Samuel's eyes widened. What? 1 week. You stay here, you help out, and I'll think about it. After that, I make my decision. That's all I'm offering. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Samuel looked at his siblings, then back at Caleb. Slowly, he nodded. 1 week, he agreed. Caleb turned back to the window. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. He could hear it moving through the valley, carrying with it the ghosts of things he'd tried to leave behind. He didn't sleep much that night. The children bedded down on the floor near the fire, Samuel and Lucas sharing a blanket, Ivy curled around the baby like a shield. Caleb lay in his cot in the corner, staring at the ceiling, listening to their breathing. He thought about the note, about Thomas's handwriting, careful and deliberate, about the words he'd read 3 times and still couldn't shake. You're still the man who carried me out of that canyon. Caleb wasn't sure that was true anymore, but as the fire burned low and the night pressed in around them, he wondered, just for a moment, if maybe it could be. The first 3 days passed in uneasy quiet. Samuel kept his word. He rose before dawn each morning and worked without complaint, splitting firewood, hauling water from the creek, feeding the horses. He moved with the kind of determination that came from necessity, not choice. Lucas followed him like a shadow, quieter, slower, but willing. Ivy stayed close to the house, tending to Rose and preparing what meals she could with the meager supplies Caleb had. Caleb watched them from a distance, still unsure what to do with the disruption they'd brought into his life. But on the 4th morning, everything changed. He was out in the corral, checking the fence post Samuel had mended, when he heard the sound. Hoofbeats, steady and deliberate, coming from the east. He straightened, shading his eyes against the morning sun. 3 riders crested the ridge. They moved slowly, scanning the property as they approached. Caleb recognized the lead rider immediately, Sheriff Dawson from Ridgefield, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and eyes like flint. The 2 men flanking him wore dusters and carried rifles slung across their saddles. Caleb's jaw tightened. He walked toward the gate as they reined in. Dawson tipped his hat. Morning, Thorne. Sheriff. Dawson's gaze drifted past him, toward the house. Heard you got visitors. Caleb didn't answer. Word travels, Dawson continued. Folks in town saw some children asking about you a few days back. Then they disappeared. Thought I'd ride out, make sure everything's settled. It is. You sure about that? Caleb crossed his arms. What's this about, Dawson? The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle, his expression hardening. Thomas Kern's dead. You know that? I do. And you know those kids are his kin. I do. Then you also know they're supposed to be in the custody of the county. Orphan children don't just get passed around like property, Thorne. There's a process. Caleb's eyes narrowed. They came to me. I didn't take them. Doesn't matter, they're minors. That makes them the county's responsibility until a legal guardian is appointed. And last I checked, you're not listed as kin. I'm listed in Thomas's note. Dawson's expression didn't shift. Notes aren't legal documents. One of the deputies shifted in his saddle, his hand resting casually on the stock of his rifle. Caleb noticed. So what? Caleb said slowly. You're here to take them? I'm here to make sure they're placed properly, Dawson replied. There's an orphanage in Ridgefield. Good people. They'll be looked after. They're being looked after here. That's not your call to make. Caleb took a step closer to the fence. His voice dropped, low and edged. I'm making it anyway. Dawson's jaw tightened. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the space between them thick with something unsaid. Then Samuel's voice cut through the silence. We're staying. Caleb turned. Samuel stood on the porch, Lucas beside him. Ivy lingered in the doorway, the baby in her arms. Dawson turned his horse slightly, studying the boy. Son, this isn't your decision either. Yes, it is, Samuel said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. Uncle Thomas sent us here. He wanted us to stay with Mr. Thorne. Your uncle's dead, and Mr. Thorne here isn't family. He's the only family we've got. Dawson's expression softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. I understand this is hard, son, but there are rules. We can't just... Rules didn't help us when our mother died, Samuel interrupted. Rules didn't help when Uncle Thomas got sick. Rules didn't keep us from ending up alone in the first place. The words hung in the air, raw and defiant. Dawson looked at Caleb, then back at Samuel. I'm sorry, the sheriff said quietly. I truly am, but I've got a job to do. He dismounted slowly, and the two deputies followed. Caleb stepped forward, positioning himself between the men and the house. They're not going anywhere, he said. Dawson stopped. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Thorne. I'm not making it anything. I'm just telling you how it is. One of the deputies moved his hand toward his rifle. Dawson raised a hand, stopping him. You willing to go to jail over this? Dawson asked. Caleb didn't blink. If that's what it takes. The silence stretched long and tight. The wind stirred the dust around their boots. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. Finally, Dawson exhaled slowly. I'll give you 3 days, that's it. 3 days to figure out how you're going to make this legal. Guardian papers, county approval, whatever it takes. If you don't, I'm coming back, and I'm bringing more men. Understood? Caleb nodded once. Dawson mounted his horse, his expression unreadable. You're walking a thin line, Thorne. Don't cross it. He turned his horse and rode back toward the ridge, the deputies following. Caleb watched them until they disappeared over the crest. When he turned back, Samuel was still standing on the porch, his fists clenched at his sides. Thank you, the boy said quietly. Caleb didn't answer. He walked past them, into the house, and closed the door behind him. But inside, his mind was already racing. 3 days. 3 days to become something he'd never been before. 3 days to decide if he could be. That evening, Caleb rode into Ridgefield alone. The town sat in a shallow valley, a cluster of buildings huddled together against the empty prairie. He tied his horse outside the lawyer's office and went inside without knocking. Augustus Vail looked up from his desk, spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He was a thin man, all angles and sharp lines, with ink-stained fingers and a perpetual frown. Caleb Thorne, he said, setting down his pen. Didn't expect to see you. I need papers drawn up, Caleb said. Guardianship. 4 children. Vail raised an eyebrow. 4? 3 and a baby. Vail leaned back in his chair, studying him. You planning to start a family, Thorne? I'm planning to keep a promise. Vail gestured to the chair across from him. Caleb sat. For the next hour, they talked through the details. Names, ages, circumstances. Vail asked questions, took notes, and occasionally frowned deeper. When Caleb mentioned Thomas Kern, Vail nodded slowly. I remember him, the lawyer said. Good man. Heard he passed. He did. And he left those children to you. He did. Vail tapped his pen against the desk. You understand what you're taking on, don't you? Guardianship isn't temporary. It's a responsibility. Food, shelter, education, discipline. You're legally bound to provide for them until they're of age. I understand. And you're sure you want this? Caleb hesitated. Then he thought about Samuel standing on the porch, defying the sheriff. He thought about Ivy's quiet pleas. He thought about the baby sleeping in her arms, oblivious and fragile. I'm sure, he said. Vail nodded. I'll have the papers ready by tomorrow evening. You'll need to sign in front of a witness, and then we'll file with the county. After that, it's done. Caleb stood. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Vail said. You're about to find out just how hard it is to raise children in this world. Caleb rode back to the ranch in the dark. the lawyer's words echoing in his mind. When he arrived, the house was quiet. The children were asleep near the fire again, tangled together like a nest of birds. He stood in the doorway for a long time, just watching them. Then he walked to the table, sat down, and pulled out Thomas's note. He read it one more time, slower now, letting the words settle. "You're still the man who carried me out of that canyon." Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. But he was going to try. The next morning, he woke the children early. "Get dressed," he said. "We're going into town." They rode together in the wagon, Samuel and Lucas in the back, Ivy holding Rose in the front seat beside Caleb. The journey was quiet but not uncomfortable. Samuel asked questions about the land. What grew here? Where the water came from? How far the property stretched? Caleb answered simply, surprised by how much the boy already understood. In Ridgefield, he stopped at the general store first. He bought flour, sugar, coffee, and a few bolts of fabric. Then he took them to the diner and ordered breakfast: eggs, bacon, biscuits with gravy. The children ate slowly, savoring every bite. Ivy looked up at him halfway through the meal. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb set down his fork. "Because you need it." "That's not an answer." He met her gaze. She was sharper than he'd given her credit for. "Because," he said slowly, "a long time ago, someone did the same for me, and I never got to pay him back." She nodded as if that made perfect sense and went back to eating. When they finished, Caleb took them to Vale's office. The lawyer had the papers ready. Caleb signed them carefully, his hand steady. Samuel watched from the corner, his eyes wide. "That's it?" the boy asked. "That's it," Vale confirmed. "You're officially under Mr. Thorne's guardianship. Legally, he's responsible for you now." Samuel looked at Caleb. "Does that mean we can stay?" Caleb nodded. "It means you're home." Lucas let out a breath he'd been holding. Ivy's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Samuel's shoulders sagged, and for the first time since Caleb had met him, the boy looked like a child again. On the ride back, the sun was high and warm, and the valley stretched out before them like a promise. Samuel sat beside Caleb this time, quiet but present. "Thank you," he said eventually. Caleb glanced at him. "You already said that." "I know, but I mean it." Caleb nodded. "You're welcome." They rode the rest of the way in silence. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb stood on the porch and looked out at the land. It didn't feel as empty as it used to, and for the first time in years, he didn't mind. Sheriff Dawson returned on the third day, just as he'd promised. He rode in alone this time. No deputies, no rifles. He dismounted slowly and walked toward the porch where Caleb stood waiting. "Well?" Dawson asked. Caleb handed him the guardianship papers. Dawson unfolded them, scanned the contents, then looked up. "You did it." "I did." Dawson folded the papers and handed them back. His expression was unreadable. "You know what you signed up for, Thorne?" "I do. Those kids are going to need more than food and shelter. They're going to need guidance, stability, a father." "I know." Dawson studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Thomas Kern chose well." He turned and walked back to his horse. Before mounting, he paused and looked back. "Good luck, Thorne. You're going to need it." Caleb watched him ride away, the papers still in his hand. The first year was hard. Samuel struggled with nightmares, waking in the dark, gasping, convinced they were still on the road. Caleb would sit with him until he fell back asleep, saying nothing, just being there. Lucas was quieter, slower to trust. But over time, he began to smile more, to laugh when Samuel teased him, to ask Caleb questions about the horses and the land. Ivy never complained. She worked harder than any child should have to, caring for Rose, cooking, mending clothes. But sometimes when she thought no one was watching, Caleb saw her staring out at the horizon with an expression he recognized: grief, longing, loss. He didn't know how to fix that, so he just made sure she knew she wasn't alone. Rose grew quickly, a bright-eyed baby who laughed easily and reached for Caleb whenever he came near. He didn't know how to hold a child at first, but Ivy taught him, patient and gentle. Eventually, it became second nature. The ranch changed too. The barn was repaired, the fences were reinforced. Samuel learned to break horses, and Lucas discovered a talent for carpentry. Ivy planted a garden behind the house, and by late summer, tomatoes and squash grew in neat rows. Neighbors began to stop by, some curious, some skeptical, some genuinely kind. Caleb didn't turn them away. He let the children answer the door, let them learn to speak for themselves, to stand tall in the world. And slowly the house began to feel less like a place he'd retreated to and more like a place he belonged. 2 years later, on a warm spring morning, Caleb stood in the corral watching Samuel work with a young mare. The boy had grown taller, stronger, his movements confident and sure. Lucas sat on the fence, carving a piece of wood with a knife Caleb had given him for his birthday. Ivy was inside, singing softly to Rose while she prepared breakfast. Caleb leaned against the fence post, arms crossed, and allowed himself a rare moment of stillness. He thought about Thomas, about the note that had changed everything, about the canyon and the weight of a body over his shoulders, and the promise he'd never made but somehow kept anyway. He thought about the man he'd been when those 3 children first sat outside his fence, alone, closed off, convinced that peace meant isolation. He'd been wrong. Peace wasn't the absence of people. It was the presence of purpose. Samuel brought the mare to a stop and turned toward Caleb, grinning. "She's ready. You want to try her?" Caleb shook his head, smiling faintly. "She's yours. You earned her." Samuel's grin widened. He led the mare toward the barn, Lucas hopping down to follow him. Ivy appeared in the doorway, Rose on her hip. "Breakfast is ready," she called. Caleb walked toward the house, his boots crunching over the dry earth. The sun was warm on his back, and the valley stretched out before him, golden and vast. He paused at the door and looked back one last time, at the corral, the barn, the ridge beyond. At the life he'd built, not alone, but together. He thought about Thomas's final words. "Do what you think is right." You always did. Caleb had tried, and maybe, just maybe, he'd succeeded. He stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and sat down at the table with his family. Years later, long after Samuel had taken over the ranch and Lucas had built his own home on the far edge of the property, long after Ivy had married and Rose had grown into a woman with her mother's green eyes and her uncle's steady heart, long after all of that, travelers passing through the valley would sometimes stop and ask about the man who'd lived there. The old rancher, they called him, the one who took in 4 orphans and raised them as his own. And the people who remembered would smile and say, "That was Caleb Thorne. He wasn't perfect, but he kept his word." And in the end, that was all that mattered.